I think it's over. I don't want to deal with them anymore. They're scum. You know what scum is? They're scum. They're sick people. They're led by sick people.
That description of the Iranian regime by the US President Donald Trump makes it sound like the negotiations between the US and Iran are over for good. But there are signs that they actually aren't, as we will discuss on this episode of Newscast. Joining me in the Newscast studio for the first time in ages is the BBC's international editor, Jeremy Bowen. Hi, Jeremy.
Hello.
Long time no see. Long time no see.
Yes, I haven't been in your studio for a little while.
Because you're an international globetrotter.
That's why.
Yes, that's why. And Caitríona Perry joins us from Washington. Hi, Caitríona.
Hi, how are you? Yeah, the world comes to Washington, but Washington does not come to London at this point.
And Newscast just spreads out across the globe virtually. Right, we're recording this episode on Wednesday at 6:20. We've all just been watching a quite rambling press conference by Donald Trump at the NATO summit in Ankara, which is wrapping up now. A few things have emerged from that, but most of the main news has been happening in the preceding 48 hours. Jeremy, let's start from the start of this latest episode. So this attack on shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, which then triggered a retaliation from the US on Tuesday night. What do we know about the kind of the spark that lit this?
Well, it's because the Strait of Hormuz, which is this narrow waterway, 20% of the world's oil and gas go through it, plus a lot of other important commodities. The central channel in it has been mined, so it can't be used right now. They're in a process of demining. There are two alternative routes. One goes past the Omani coast, the country opposite Iran.
Yeah, on the western side.
Yep. The other one goes past the Iranian coast. And surprise, surprise, the Iranians want that channel to be used. They do not want the other channel to be used. And they now they haven't said that they actually carried out the attacks, but it's hard to see who else could have done it. So, they are making a point that they are prepared to take all sorts of risks, to take it to the brink, to possibly collapse or risk the collapse, I should say, of the negotiations that are going on with the Americans via intermediaries in defense of what they say are their really important principles, their red lines. And of those, perhaps the reddest of the red lines is control of the Strait of Hormuz, because while they might be, I've spoken to people involved in these talks, while they are perhaps under the right circumstances prepared to do a deal about navigation through the strait, because that's also in their interests, it has to be in the context of not giving up on the principle that they decide who goes through. And what they will not do is go back to the way they were on the 27th of February, the day before the Israeli-American attack on them, when, let's not forget, ships were happily going back and forth through that strait. And a direct consequence of the war has been its closure. And
So in other words, they want the Strait of Hormuz to be open, but they want it to be open under their control.
Yeah, under their control,
that.
because they know that it's a choke point for the entire world economy, which they can actually start choking in just a couple of days if they need to. So for them, it's an absolutely brilliant weapon.
And we'll come on to the wider context in a second and what it means for the peace negotiations, if that's what we're even calling them. Caitríona, what have we learned about the US retaliation on Tuesday night?
Well, we had a statement from CENTCOM saying that they had hit over 80 targets with precision munitions as a response to what Jeremy's been outlining there. They hit air defence systems, command and control centres, coastal radar sites as well, anti-ship missile capabilities. President Trump sort of described it as having hit all of their little ships, whatever was left of them. And they, I think, which totaled in around 60 small boats belonging to the IRGC. And that's kind of where it's at the moment, although he has warned a couple of times today that he will hit Iran hard, to use his language, again later tonight. And he sort of said, you can take that as my little warning to you.
And then when Donald Trump was talking at the NATO summit in Ankara, and he's had a few appearances in public there today, he said this particularly ear-catching thing about the Iranian regime.
I think it's over. I don't want to deal with them anymore. They're scum. You know what scum is? They're scum. They're sick people. They're led by sick people. And they're vicious, violent people. And if they had a nuclear weapon, they'd use it. As far as I'm concerned, it's over. I'll speak to our negotiators. They want to negotiate. They're good people. Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner. But they have to come back to me. As far as I'm concerned, it's just a waste of time dealing with them. They're liars. We make a deal. And if I make a deal with him, we have a deal, and he goes out, he talks. We make a deal. Everyone's agreed. No nuclear weapon. We make a deal. They go outside, talk to the press. They say, we never even talked about it. There's something wrong with them. They're cuckoo. As far as I'm concerned, it's over.
As far as Donald Trump is concerned, I don't know, does he mean the ceasefire's over, or the negotiations are over, or the whole situation is over?
Talks, I think.
Yeah. What's your take on what he's just said there, Jeremy?
Well, he's already pulled back from it a bit, actually, because also in a little way on in that sort of speech that he made, I was trying to find the right word. He then said, "Look, the guys, they want to continue. They want to continue with it. So, I'm going to let them, but it's not going to go anywhere." And then later on, just before he headed for the airport, he was asked at a press conference then, so is the war's back on? He said, no, it's not back on. Not back on. This is because he doesn't have a better option than talking. And that this is not
because bombing Iran hasn't actually changed the Iranian regime or changed their position.
Yeah,
these things.
I've just put together a TV piece, and the final shots of it was an extraordinary video news release that the Pentagon have released, and it's like a scene from Top Gun, filmed a little while ago. It says last month, but with the array of U.S. naval might and helicopters and bombers and planes, and all it's missing is Tom Cruise, though he might have been in there somewhere perhaps. And the point is, it's almost like they don't get it. They're up against the limits of their military power, and even though their military power is remarkable and unmatched, what they have not done is break the will of the regime in Tehran. Far from that. They've actually emboldened them and perhaps even strengthened them, even though, of course, billions of dollars of damage has been done. It's we're under no doubts. America can break anything they want in Iran. But the point is, accept the will of the hard men in the regime.
And I suppose, Katrina, we've seen this a lot of times now. Donald Trump being very belligerent when he's in public and the cameras are on, but then the US actually being a bit more pragmatic when it comes to sitting around a table in private.
We have, and the comments he made today about the regime, I mean, he set that aside, what he was saying about them just about a month or so ago, and he was saying they were nice people, very rational, and everything was progressing really well. And now he's back to this commentary, and he was asked in that sort of second press conference that he did, why have you changed your tune in such a dramatic way? And he said, I got to know them. They're loco, he says, using the Spanish word for crazy. And I think there's a sense that we've seen from President Trump now by this stage, haven't we, of, he sort of says whatever he says in front of the cameras, which doesn't necessarily tally up with what's going on behind the scenes, because at another point today he spoke about how in Iran they wanted to have a decent funeral for the Ayatollah Khamenei, who was killed on the first day of the war, and that they had wanted to sort of pause talks, and the Americans had agreed to that, to let that funeral procession take place. And now he's saying, the talks are off. I don't know if I'll even engage in talks, he said at one point in the second press conference. I might just finish the job. Now, what does finish the job mean? Jeremy, as you've been saying, talks are really the only route out that the Americans have at this point. So you're trying to put all the statements that President Trump has made today in a line with each other and sort of find what is the common thread running up there as to just what the American position is right now.
Yeah, Jeremy, give us a bit of intel about what's actually going on in these negotiations and what might happen once they restart after the break for the funeral of the Supreme Leader.
Yeah, I chat from time to time to people involved in the talks. And, the atmosphere today around them, surrounding the people who are doing the mediation, is said to be tense because of what's happened. This was not something that they wanted. They were hoping that they were making progress towards a deal where Iran would find a way to agree to a navigation deal through the Strait and then move on to some of the other stuff. Because let's not forget, all this talking is just to get back to where they were the day before the war was started by the Americans and the Israelis. The more really substantive stuff about Iran's nuclear plans, the whereabouts of its enriched uranium, what Trump calls the nuclear dust. It's actually a gas, I believe. All of that stuff, they're not even onto that quite yet. And you mentioned earlier, are they really peace talks? No, they're not. What's going on at the moment is essentially discussion of an agenda, 14-point memorandum of understanding, something like 2 pages, a bit less than that. So they're talking about what they're going to be talking about. But a prerequisite is to try to get the navigation going through the strait, and that is proving very difficult. Essentially, the thinking, as I assess it, as it's been indicated, is that if, and this is one way of selling it potentially to Trump, there can be a great big deal that changes the Middle East, and actually it is a coherent argument to say that the only countries that could change the Middle East, probably external players, America is the external player, and Iran as well, because they control so much in the region. So if they could do it, normalize relations in some way, it would be transformational. But what we're seeing is how difficult that process could be.
Yeah, and so on the one hand, Trump could get his world historical moment where he is the world historical figure that he wants to be, and that then is cover for the fact that on a sort of short and medium term, he's not really achieved anything in Iran.
And they'd have to, as well, to do a deal with Iran, is you've got to give them something in return. They're not going to, and something concrete. They're not going to take promises.
So basically that would be allowing them to sell their oil on the international market, unfreezing their assets, lifting all the sanctions.
And also there would be a deal on the nuclear thing. And they've done deals on their nuclear ambitions before. They did them with, in the Obama years, in the so-called JCPOA, which Trump pulled out of, saying it was the worst deal in the history of deals. So that's where they're at right now. But it's going to be a long and difficult process. But the main thing is neither the Americans or the Iranians want to get into where they were. They don't want to get into a full-scale shooting war. They both have strong reasons not to do it.
Just a bit of breaking news from the NATO summit, and it comes from Chris Mason, who says the Prime Minister was handed a personalised gun with live ammunition as a gift from the host of the NATO summit, the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. The weapon has Sir Keir Starmer's name written on it. A similar gift was given to the leader of each NATO country in attendance. Now, Katrina, that sounds like a present designed to appeal to Donald Trump, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Although normally when you hand a leader a revolver, it's for them to,
with a bottle
to use
of whiskey.
it. Exactly. It's a famous image for resigning.
Is this some kind of like after dinner party game they're doing at the NATO summit?
Russian roulette. My question is, whose name's written on the bullets of the Prime Minister's guns?
Exactly. Or maybe the recipient can add their own.
You can, while we're on the subject of guns, you can buy a golden AK-47 with Donald Trump's signature embossed on it. That's one of the sort of things that his fundraising team sell. So yes, if he got one of those presents, I think he will have been very happy with it.
Merch.
Oh yeah.
Yes. Right, Jeremy, I know you've got to go and be on the news channel in about 4 minutes, so I'll let you kick off this bit of the conversation and then you can leave. The other conflict that's been the focus of the world's attention in the NATO summit this week is Russia and Ukraine, and there's been actually a big development kind of when it comes to military kit, and also just a big development in terms of the diplomatic warmness between Zelensky and Trump.
Yeah, we talk a lot about the way that Trump moves from A to B via Z and back again.
Or he would say Z.
Yeah. Z. Yeah, absolutely. And think back to that verbal shootout in the Oval Office back, when was it, last year?
February last year.
Yeah. When Trump berated him and Zelensky stood up for himself. Trump said, "You've got no cards, you're a dictator, you started the war." All lies, of course. And now, though, maybe it's because Trump likes a winner and Ukraine is doing rather well on the battlefield with their skills in drone warfare. He has granted something that has been at the top of President Zelensky's wish list for ages, which is the right to manufacture under license the Patriot interceptor missile, which they don't have enough of. I've been in Kharkiv in the northeast when they're being hit by ballistic missiles fired out of Russia. And I remember that day the mayor saying, We don't have any Patriot missiles. The only thing that'll deal with this is a Patriot. We haven't got one.
Because they're a very effective
They're very effective, proven weapon. It's been around for 30-odd years. The first Gulf War, more than 30 years ago, is when they debuted. So, it's a very effective technology. I think up to now, only the Germans and the Japanese have been given licenses to make them. So this isn't just a really important thing for Zelensky for his war effort, though clearly it's going to take a while to set up the factories. What I think is almost equally significant is that it shows that Trump has, for this anyway, has navigated away from his affinity with President Putin of Russia. Because this is something, of course, the Russians are not going to like at all. And, earlier on this year, I was in Ukraine in February when it was all frozen solid. And that was the time when Trump and Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were saying to the Ukrainians, you have to give up territory that the Russians have never been able to capture in order to get some kind of a ceasefire. And of course, Zelensky refused. And they've gone from that in just half a year to a situation where top of the wish list has been granted. And so Zelensky is going to go back to Kiev really happy about what's been achieved.
Although, as you point out, Jeremy, getting that agreed in person is one thing. Actually, the kit being manufactured locally and then being able to defend Ukrainian cities is such a long way off.
It is.
And there's a shortage of these Patriots globally.
Yeah, because the Americans have been burning through their own supplies in the Middle East.
Gulf allies.
And Israel.
Yeah. Jeremy, I'm going to let you go and speak to the news channel. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yeah, Katrina, what's your take on Trump's massive warming towards Zelensky?
Yes, it's interesting. I think Zelensky will be going home a very happy man after all of this. And I agree with Jeremy there. It's the symbolism of it above all else, because interestingly, President Trump said to President Zelensky, yes, I'm giving you those licenses. And then he said the manufacturers, the companies who own those licenses don't know yet. But it'll be okay, we'll work it out, don't worry, sort of thing. So that shows even more that this was a President Trump sort of move towards, warming up, leaning back into Ukraine again. As to the practical situation here, I mean, yes, the factories have to be built. Then, only about 600 of these a year can be made once factories are up and running. So by the time Ukraine would actually be able to manufacture and have delivery of their own Patriots, I think they would hope the war would nearly be over by then. But I think it more importantly is that reestablishing of the alliance. And President Trump was talking again with President Zelensky about the possibility of a three-leader summit and saying, maybe you would come to Moscow, Volodymyr, for that, would you? Because President Putin has said, oh yeah, I'll do a three-way summit, but only if it's in Moscow.
President Putin said, I would love to meet in Moscow. And I said, I don't think, I have to put myself in his position. I don't know that he'd go to Moscow. Maybe he would. Would you go to Moscow?
It's difficult. There are a lot of Ukrainian drones there. That's right. It's dangerous for me.
He doesn't want to be hit by a drone.
Europe.
No, it's hard. It's hard to go to Moscow.
Even the fact that they're having these sort of jokes, if you want to call them that, and those more warm conversational tones, it's just so far away, isn't it, from what Jeremy was describing there in February of last year in the Oval Office.
And also, here's what I'm thinking, that maybe a product of Trump being kind of hands off on Ukraine, if you will, has maybe helped Ukraine in the sense of, and it is about the Ukrainian drones in Moscow, because Ukraine has really, really upped the ante and the significance of their attacks into Russia, so much so that James Landale was on the radio this morning going and vox popping people who are queuing for petrol in Moscow because Russian oil refineries can't produce enough fuel because they've been hit by Ukrainian weapons. I remember an era when Joe Biden was president and they wouldn't even provide certain bits of kit to Kyiv for defensive purposes because they were worried that would be perceived as an escalation by the Russians. I wonder if a byproduct of Trump just sort of not caring as much is that Ukraine is kind of unleashed and are able to do these attacks much more spectacularly and more deeply into Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the European partners and, the UK and the EU members have all had to lean in a lot more closely to Ukraine than perhaps they would have if the big brother of the US was there as well. So they've all sort of developed this other nexus of giving extra, whether it's loans for defense weaponry or actual cash and other things to help Ukraine do that. And also, let's not forget, Russia has responded with some very intense strikes, particularly in the last couple of weeks or so. So I think we are in an escalatory phase, regardless of, sort of who's to blame for it or to take credit for it. But, the US being absent from it has probably changed the trajectory in a different way.
And it's almost like Chris Mason has been listening to this recording because he's now
Where is he?
updated his copy from Ankara saying, in addition, we have learnt the personalised gun was a revolver. So Keir Starmer has been handed a revolver, but not a bottle of whiskey. And it's understood the bullets didn't have anyone's names on them.
Thank you, Chris, for asking that question for us.
Yeah, anything else you'd like to know, Katrina, while Chris is eavesdropping?
I don't know. It feels like an episode of Cluedo. Like, what room were they in when they got the revolver?
Yes, the NATO summit room. And just in terms of another kind of diplomatic thing that's happened with Trump today, he has repeated his attack on Spain for not being a good ally. But then I see Spain has fired back, if you pardon the gun pun, by saying, well, actually, it's quite hard for the US to threaten an individual member of the EU with tariffs, for example, because the EU is one big block when it comes to tariffs. So you can single out Spain verbally and rhetorically, but not commercially.
Yeah, I mean, there's a long time argy-bargy going on between the US and Spain over the last few months, and sort of trading barbs like this. It's a sort of sport at this point in time, and I think that's par for the course in a way. Before the big news lines of today in terms of the licenses of the Patriot missiles for Ukraine and the decision to restart bombing Iran last night, all of the focus at the beginning of the NATO summit was on that awkwardness between leaders, and President Trump bringing back up Greenland again in his opening remarks with the Turkish president yesterday. So, I think these things bubble up when President Trump is there with all of the European leaders, but essentially, as Spain has put it, they're part of the EU bloc, so tariff one, tariff all.
Also, these NATO summits, in fact, any international or multinational gathering that Trump appears at now, people seem to have got a bit more used to the fact that there's ups and downs and the whole event is a roller coaster. This feels much less sort of existential for the fate of NATO as previous summits.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the fact that people know how he's going to react to them now, they kind of know what he's going to say as well. And they also know that what he says today might be something else next week. So I think leaders, particularly because so many of them have made the sort of path, the trek down the gravel driveway of the White House to see President Trump as well. They're building those personal relationships, which are so key. I mean, President Trump himself always says he's a one-to-one guy, and he likes to build those kind of that bit of rapport with leaders that they're sort of figuring it out, and it doesn't feel like, this is the end of days. And also he's happy that member states have increased their defence spending as well. I mean, he sees that as a win. He would like it to be higher, obviously. But he feels like he goes in there with an amount of power that perhaps is greater than some of the others around the table.
And we are seeing the reality of what the other NATO members do when the Americans don't seem as reliable a member of the alliance, because we've got today the leaders of Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Romania, Spain, Sweden, Turkey and the UK saying that they're going to set up this deep precision strike capability investment initiative, which is a lot of words and acronyms for saying they're going to spend £37 billion, euros, dollars, $50.6 billion, so about £37 billion over the next 10 years to develop their own long-range missile capability. So there's an example of actually, that's a thing they didn't have to do 5 years ago, but they're now having to do now because of Trump.
Yeah, exactly. They're building their new alliances, their new sort of we'll move on without you, US, thank you very much. You're not as reliable as you once were. And, I was speaking to a few sort of international diplomats here in the US last night about Ukraine and those recent big strikes from Russia. We saw Poland scrambling jets last week, for example, didn't we, because of how intense the strike on Kyiv was. And, many of those countries are extremely nervous about where this is going with Russia. Russia that, you know, President Putin is now so perhaps frustrated and is being targeted so far into Russia. Those fuel shortages are becoming more common, that they are worried about what happens next. And so it's not surprising to see what you're talking about there. And I think we'll see many other schemes like that. We already have seen them, where countries are sort of building their own resources and counting the US out.
Well, Caitríona, good to catch up for the second time this week.
Yes, what a pleasure. Talk soon.